Okay, thanks everyone. I'm Stephen Marquardt and I'm presenting today's session on analytics in Vula, and I'm joined by my colleague Sam Lee Pan, whom many of you know also from the Vula team in SILT. And we are talking about analytics in Vula particularly, and what you can find out about your students and what they're doing online. So thank you for joining us. If you'd like to put questions or comments into the chat as we go along, then please feel free to do that. I am going to put a link into the chat, which is in fact the same one that's on the slide there, which is a link to our analytics document. If you'd like to follow along, it also has links to the dashboard, interactive dashboard, if you'd like to have a look at that. Okay, so I'm going to switch my video off because mainly we'll be talking to the slides. I'm a bit less familiar with Zoom because I spend most of my life in Teams, but here we go. Okay, so today we're looking at using analytics and the data you have available to look at student activity and engagement in your course sites. We'll go through two different tools that are available and how you can find them and use them, and then think about how you can use analytics to improve the way that students experience your course and that you run your course, and we'll take some questions and discussion. So broadly speaking, when we think about all the different types of data that we have on students and what they're doing, it is divided into things that we know about students before they start the course. And that could be where they came from, what their individual personal background is, what they did in their NSC, for example, if they're in second or third year, what they did in previous university courses. So the picture of students as they arrive in the first day of your course. And some of that already can tell you a lot about those students and what they may or may not struggle with. Even what particular program they're in might reflect a different experience that different cohorts of students have in your course. Then during the course, we're particularly concerned here with what we can see and track reflecting online activity. And this was much more of a minority concern in a sense for blended courses taught on campus in 2019, because you saw most of your students quite often, and so there was a sense of being able to understand what they were doing. And in 2020, everything moved online, and so this became critical to seeing what was actually happening, and particularly were students showing up, what was the level of their engagement, what difficulties did they face. So we introduced some new analytics last year, particularly around the access survey, which spanned that concern of were students going to be able to show up at all online through into, if they're logging in, what are they actually doing? And what we can look at in general is firstly online presence, which is simply, are they logging in and are they showing up on the system? The second one is online activity, and that is what individual sequence of actions are students taking when they're interacting with Vula in your course site, for example. And then there's online engagement, which I put in there, but starts to cross over into a more qualitative understanding of what engagement is. So really what we have is somewhere between activity and engagement, which we'll get to, but you can never entirely say that a particular pattern of online activity reflects active engagement, because students may be experiencing something in very different ways. They might have clicked play on a video and then walked out of the room, or they might be watching the video intently, and those might be two different experiences of engaging with video material. And then there's a qualitative aspect to posting a message in a forum, for example, that could reflect something that's very carefully thought through as a student contribution, or it could just be a task ticking exercise. So one always needs to think of analytics as an approximation of what's happening, but it's not obviously the full truth as to what's going on. And then the next indicators that are, in a sense, more reliable is what's happening in formative and summative assessment. So the data that you get from engagement will generally suggest a pattern of attainment in assessment, but where you have solid assessment data, that's generally always more reliable than data that you have from a pattern of participation, for example. And then finally, summative assessment towards the end of the course. You can see what finally happened, but at a point where it's too late to intervene if you want to change something. So broadly speaking, analytics is this process of taking data in raw material that can be very voluminous and granular. You're not sure what it all means. Some layer of filtering, of analysis, of summarization, and hopefully that can lead you towards some action in response to what you're seeing, depending on what's coming up through that process. So I mentioned two different tools in Vula that we're going to look at today. The first one is called the Student Analytics, and last year you would have been familiar with this possibly as a tool called Course Analytics, and it is similar, except that we've just renamed it to be a little clearer about what it actually is. And the second one is SiteStats, which has been in Vula for quite some time and has been updated slightly and gives you more insight into your course specifically. And then there's a third view, which is a student analytics dashboard, which is a sort of higher university-wide level view picture of what's happening around activity, but might still be helpful to you at a course or program level, for example. So firstly, there's some people aren't always sure what to start with and why you would look at either SiteStats or student analytics. And Sam created this sort of helpful graphic, which just reflects 4 different questions that you might have and which of these tools would answer that question for you. So if you want to find students who haven't visited your specific course site, the SiteStats tool can tell you that and give you a list of students who haven't visited your course site in the last 3 days, for example. The second one is more granular. If you want to find students who have or have not read a particular reading that might be part of your course requirements, again, SiteStats can tell you that. Student Analytics, on the other hand, is looking at Vula activity across all of the courses that students are participating in. So it's designed to give the sense of students the participation in their academic program generally online, rather than information about their participation in your course specifically. And there are 2 sort of bands of concern. The one might be students who've been classified as orange categorized, which reflects a limited degree of participation online, and a red category, which is no participation online at all. So when we introduced this color coding last year, it was partly in response to the large uncertainty about what was actually going to happen when the university moved online, because there were so many variables about the conditions of access to the internet, for example. And right at the beginning, it wasn't clear whether the whole exercise was viable. We thought it would be, but this was important to sort of establish how big the zone of difficulty, like how many students were able to participate actively, confidently every week, how many students might have logistical issues, access issues, for example. And thanks, Lanka, in the chat. That's a great question. Student Analytics looks at all Vula sites that they're enrolled to. So that's the key difference between SiteStats. SiteStats is one site, your site that you're in at the moment. Student Analytics is activity across all sites. So one of the differentiators here is if you're not sure if a student has dropped off the map entirely, they're just not logging in completely, or whether they're just neglecting your course. So SiteStats will tell you they're not visiting your course, and then your follow-up question is, are they doing any other work? Student Analytics will tell you that. Okay, so we'll start with the higher level, broader tool, which is student analytics. And this is designed, it's useful for course conveners, but it can also be used at a department or program or faculty level, in the sense that you can put it into Vula sites that have a membership that is much bigger than the course. So you could put this into a faculty orientation site or into a all science undergraduate site, for example, and it would give you the picture of all of the students in that site, but again, remembering that it goes across all Vula sites, not only a specific site. So it's what it shows you is the cohort of students that you have placed into your Vula site, but it shows you their activity across everything. So the first purpose of this was to, last year particularly, to enable faculties to follow up with students who weren't logging in entirely. So we saw students that possibly had issues getting laptop access, or they might have had data issues. And that was important, particularly in the beginning of ERT, to see what types of support the university could offer. That might still be a concern this year. It's something less of a concern because we have many more students in university residences, so they don't have the same access problems. But we're not entirely clear what the quality of access is, for example, of students who are not in residence and also may not have chosen to come to Cape Town. So it's still something we're concerned to see how the academic year is kicking off and what levels of participation we have. So the student analytics tool, the details there, how to add it to your Vula site. It's just like adding any other tool, except it's in the special category called external tools. And sorry, that slide says course analytics, but it is actually student analytics. So site setup, manage tools, external tools, and you'll see it listed there as an option. And this is what it looks like. This is a view in large first year maths course. And you can see these color coding bands here are putting people into green, orange, yellow, or red. And keep in mind that in the current week, this will be based on activity so far. So week 11 is last week, and there was sort of 2% of students who hadn't logged in yet. This week, obviously, it's Wednesday today, Monday was a public holiday, so there might be some students who are just not doing every course every single day, and we would expect these figures to improve as the week moves on. But again, that depends on what students are required to do in your course as to what pattern of participation you expect. What is important here is you can choose to download a CSV file, and that will open up into a spreadsheet, and it will give you a list of student numbers, and it will give you the color classification by week, and it will also give you information on their device access. So you can see here we flagged one of the criteria for orange is that you are logging in only from a phone, perhaps not from a laptop or desktop, which might be some indication of like access difficulties. And it also reflects limited participation. So perhaps you've accessed content, but you haven't posted messages in forums or chat, for example. So again, from a faculty level, this is where we'd expect this to be used on following up with the red students, for example, because that means they're not participating in any of their courses. And largely that would be a sort of program faculty advising level type of follow-up rather than course conveners following up directly with those students, but that might depend on arrangements in faculties. So that's what the student analytics tool will show you inside Vula. Okay, so I'm just going to comment here quickly a question from Deshni. Can we also collect data on staff or guests? All of that data is collected, but we don't report on it in all contexts. So in the student analytics tool, what you'll see there is data only for users who are in the student role. So we're not showing participation by tutors or by lecturers, for example. You will see that activity data in site stats. So the site stats tool is not limited with one exception to the role that you're in. And you can also ask us for a custom report if there's some particular question that is not answered. Picking up two questions from Peter in the chat. This is not visible to students in that it just gives you a default message to students that it's not, it's accessible for tutors and site owners. It's typically people would choose to hide this tool so it doesn't show up in the list of tools to students. It is a question we could possibly show this to students, with the exception obviously of the CSV download, but we haven't so far. Right, and so Peter, your other question is about dealing with different programs. So the purpose of this really is to just understand students and their engagement with the university as a whole in their online learning engagement. So as a faculty, for example, or if you ran a particular program, you could put all of your students into a Vula site as a way of tracking or engaging with those students. But again, it's not, it's reflecting more than engagement with your own course. So you could have a student who shows up as orange or green, but has not visited your course site, for example. So site stats is the only tool that will tell you specifically who has visited your course site. You could be a student and you've interacted with 3 out of 4 of your courses and you haven't visited the 4th site. You might show up green, but site stats would show that you haven't visited the one specific site, for example. Jamia, this student analytics does not have a view for individual students. The only way to get that is to download into a CSV file, and then you can filter that, for example, by the spreadsheet columns that you would see. So there is an individual student view in site stats, which we will show you. Okay, so this is the color coding when we look at these green, orange, and red. So the red is the simplest category, which means that you just did not log into Vula. So we have no sign of your online presence whatsoever. And that's obviously a concern. It could also be students who've registered and deregistered, or they registered very late and hadn't yet started interacting online, for example. So there could be some legitimate cases that don't reflect access barriers, or this could be an access barrier issue. This year, we would expect everyone to have internet access, and that so much has taken place online that all students would have had to have registered online. So it doesn't seem likely that there are a lot of students who just absolutely have no access, unlike ERT when people left campus. So that's the red category. The green category is what we've come up with a classification for to mean a type of active engagement. And so the definition here is firstly laptop or desktop as a device that you've logged in on 2 or more days during the week. You've gone to 2 or more course sites. You've accessed 3 different content items at least, and you've taken some action that is communication or assessment or a contribution. So you've created something rather than just simply logged in and browsed around content. So what we want to reflect here is active participation rather than just you logged in and you clicked around and you logged out. It's quite a low bar to meet this. On the other hand, we also see students who are not meeting this. It also may not reflect all activity that students are doing. So we are recording here only tasks that are taking place in Vula. There might be student requirements for participation that are happening outside Vula, either online or in person, where the students are very actively engaged, but the analytics just aren't capturing that data. So it is some indication, but it shouldn't be taken as a sort of a gold standard. We generally don't tell people to be too concerned about the like a hard line between green and orange. And the orange criteria is everything was not green. So you did log into Vula, but you didn't meet one of those thresholds. And so you're classified as potentially less active or not participating as actively as other students. Okay, so the SiteStats tool, on the other hand, is quite detailed, and it's about your course site and what students did in your course site, down to more detail than you would get through student analytics. So the most common question here is who has not visited the site? And that is something that you can run a custom report to do, or you can view quite easily. What are the most commonly used resources? What's the pattern of access to a particular resource? And this helps you understand what students are doing in relation to the course design and what you're expecting them to do. It is summarized to some extent. So across Vula, there's an enormous amount of activity data that's generated, and it's too much to sort of show everything all the time. So there's some degree of summarization, which sometimes is helpful and sometimes is not, but that's what it is. So it's like a mid-level of granularity. It's not every single action, but it's not the volume that you would get from that either. There's some constraints here. So lecture recording activity, particularly playing back videos that are in lecture videos, is not recorded in SiteStats. We can generate custom reports for that type of video activity for a course for a period of time, and we can do that on request to the Vula help desk, and we can email you back a PDF. And then the other limitation is that activity in Teams and Zoom and third-party tools that are plugins to Vula that may appear within Vula but are not actually part of it, though that activity is not captured in SiteStats. So again, this might be a case where you have students who are very active, but you might have set up your course in such a way that their activity is not within Vula directly. So you would capture their logins and their visits to Vula, but you wouldn't see, for example, the type of activity that might classify them as green in the other tool. So this is just a constraint to remember, that it gives you part of the picture, but not the whole picture about what students are doing. This is the home page of SiteStats. So you'll see here classifications for site visits, activity, resources, and lesson pages. And these are all cases where you can drill down to get more detail. And then you can also design custom reports. So this is like a home dashboard. Some of these are not particularly useful, like this total number of events. It's just a big number, but things like the number of students who haven't visited your site, for example, is important. Right, this preferences is what counts as activity, and there may be things that you don't want to measure, or you may want to tick this, and I think this relates to what is shown as activity on the dashboard there. The custom reports are probably the most helpful part of SiteStats, because again, you can design something that will show you the data that would answer a particular question about interaction with your site. So again, if you have, for example, a common reading or resource that students are expected to access in week 1 and something else in week 2, then you could look at the extent of access to those, and it would give you some sense of which students were following along with the design that you had laid out for them. You can create these reports and you can save them, so you can run them again at a future date, and you can also export the results of them into a spreadsheet for further analysis or for follow-up. So this note here also says that resources that are linked in lessons will show here. So if you put a file into resources in your Vula site, and that's included in one of the lessons pages, it's going to record the access to the resource when people click through to it from lessons, for example. And the same would go for videos that are uploaded directly into lessons, embedded in lessons, rather than through lecture videos. So this is an example of site visits, and one of the most commonly asked things here is, again, how to identify who has not visited the site. And it's slightly counterintuitive when you define this, because there's an option that you have to select, which is essentially none. So the criteria for the report is users who have visited the site, and then you select this none option, and then it inverts the criteria. So it produces a list of users who haven't visited the site. These reports, again, shows that you can create a report and you can save them. So you can go back and run them at any future time. And here are the most common, some of the most common events that you might want to report on. So visiting the site is obviously the most common activity here. Are you showing up? Resources and lessons. Are you working through the material that's been presented, for example, week by week? Forums and chat around participation, communication, and then assessment events, so assignments and tests and quizzes. Those tools also have their own logs and activities, so you can go into tests and quizzes and see activity for a particular student, for example, in the event log. In the assignments grading page, you can see a submission date. So it's also possible to use those, obviously, but SiteStats will let you sort of see that in a common forum, common format. Okay, this is a new feature which has been introduced this year, and one of the things to be aware of is that it only counts data from the 13th of March, because we switched on this just before the start of term. And so if you had a course that started prior to this time, you won't see activity before the 13th of March. And it lets you select a single student and select a date range, and then it will give you a list of the different events that are recorded for that student. This is often the type of query that comes to the Vula Help Desk, particularly if there's a query about whether a student took an assessment or what they did to sort of settle a claim about who did or didn't do what, sometimes around DP requirements. And so this would let you answer some of those questions yourself. And you'll see there's a date time for the event itself, and then a details link. And if you get a show more button, you can click on it. One disadvantage here is that you cannot download this into a spreadsheet. So it's limited to being able to view this data online. You can also filter by tool, because you may get many more events than you want to see. So content events, if you have a lot of resources, for example, you'll just see lots and lots and lots of content events. So that's one simple, obvious thing to do, is to filter those out. Okay, so one of the things that you may wish to do is follow up with students who are doing something or not doing something that you're expecting them to do. So for example, students who haven't visited the site, or you run a report so you've identified that they haven't worked through some of the material and they needed to by then. So the first process there is to run a report to identify those students. You can then get their list of student numbers, and you can create a group for those students by cutting and pasting the student numbers into a custom group through the group manager tool. And that then allows you to target those students specifically for announcements or messages. And you can also send them SMS messages if you want to. Largely, again, that's the case for students who just haven't showed up at all online, but we would expect most students to at least be reading email at this stage. So that's the follow-up route. You can obviously also use the CSV download from Student Analytics as the source, or you can use the SiteStats report as a source of students that you would like to follow up with. So what are all these for, and what can one do with the analytics? So I spoke a little bit about the role of these types of reports and dashboards last year, and the big uncertainty around ERT and access, and the big concerns were logistics, things like data and laptops and all of that, and the students were suddenly shifting into a completely different mode. We expect that that's less of an issue this year, although we might still see some difficulties, and particularly a lot of students registered very late because of the challenges around the NSFAS confirmation of student funding and the decision to list the fee block. So we are seeing a lot of students come in with late registrations that haven't necessarily gone through orientation or some of those support processes. So the very first level is like, who are these students who are in the red category, which is somewhere around 2%? What's the difficulty? Is there anything the university can do about it? Are they planning to continue studying? Then at that point, once we're 2 or 3 weeks into the teaching, the value of the analytics is in testing your assumptions about what students are doing in relation to what you had hoped they would do or what you've set up for them to do as a set of learning activities or a learning pathway through lessons. And so this is where the ability to look at access to a particular resource that might be on that pathway is useful. And sometimes also the timing of access. So again, if we find a case where students are doing everything very last minute, submitting assignments all within the last hour or something, it's an indication of time stress, or that students aren't working through material in a way that gives them enough time to sort of think and reflect on what they're doing. And some of that information might be useful as a course design prompt, in a sense, to think, well, this particular week was laid out with the expectation that students would look at this material on Monday and Tuesday and then do a midweek assessment and then something else. But in fact, we find that most people are only doing this just in time. They're either not setting aside the right amount of time, or they don't have time to do it, or perhaps they're doing the assessment having skipped the material completely. So that obviously becomes very specific to your course and your course design. And the analytics are there to, again, allow you to understand what students are actually doing in relation to what your design ideas were about what they should do. And then to the extent that it's possible to follow up with students, provide them with additional support, or in some, obviously that's very valuable. Otherwise, some of that can feed into the course redesign for the next time that you run it, or the following year. Okay, so largely it's quite important to notice here that there's no single pattern of what student activity should be on a course site, in part because the way course sites are created is so different and varied across the university, which in some ways is an obstacle for students themselves, because they are not sure how to navigate across the different experiences in different courses, but that's a slightly bigger, longer term problem. But you have to look at site stats in relation to the course design. And there's an argument as well for saying that where you set up your course to require a set of regular paced activities, that's not only good for students, but it's also good for the feedback loop, because those regular activities will show up in activity data. And it will give you a better understanding of student interaction, rather than, say, a major assessment that's sort of 6 weeks in, but you might not really have a good handle on how students have been working leading up to that point. The green, orange, yellow is also there because it gives you a very quick indication of what's happening in student patterns or behavior. So if we saw the red category rise significantly, for example, that would be an issue. If COVID comes back as a third wave and we get much stricter restrictions for access in campus, we might start to see location-based difficulties. If students are depending on campus, they're no longer able to access campus, for example, then again, internet connectivity might become an issue. So seeing a pattern of engagement from week to week stay relatively stable would be an encouraging sign. And then I mentioned here some of these issues are access issues rather than learning issues. So they're not so much about course design, but just these factors like home environment, quality of internet connection, do people have quiet places to study? And we're in this sort of middle space last year where last year, the sort of design goal was around 30 hours of student activity per week, taking into account some of these difficulties. And this year we're back to a full course load, but we're aware we're still in a pandemic. There are still difficulties for some students. And then again, how people might use or choose to use these in faculties and departments varies, and we're interested in what you need and what you have to say. That's the end of the slides. Oh, not quite. Okay. So I'm putting in here a commercial break as well for a broader project we have, which is data analytics for student success. And some of you have been somewhat involved in this. One of our goals here is to make more data available, particularly to course conveners, to support data-informed decision-making. And one of the activities this year is to provide richer data sets about the students that are coming into your courses from information that the university already holds through admissions and student records, for example. And we've been recently running some focus groups on what types of visualizations and reports are useful. So that goes back to the characterization of your student cohort on day one. Like, who are these students? Where do they come from? Which students might have particular difficulties. And so you'll see some of that work in the analytics space during the year. And then again, a reminder of this link to the bit.ly Vula Anaytics, which is links to the dashboard and information about site stats. And please do feel free to send us any feedback or suggestions. As I mentioned, the DAS project is working actively on building the learning analytics ecosystem. And so we are in an ideas and requirements gathering phase for the types of tools and reporting and visualization that we'd like to make available in the future. And my other colleagues for joining us. Have a great day and enjoy the rest of your week.